or staying, as Kelly just said. Did any of us ever go home? No. I haven't brushed my hair since like 6:30 this morning or something. I can feel it. It's just getting bigger. We're really excited about this panel. I am the most nervous about Reed. This is Reed Wagner. He has this beautiful paper and presentation that he sent to me that is so far over my head that I'm counting on the linguists in the room. I said to Reed, oh God, this is so smart. I'm so excited you're presenting it. Reed is finishing up his bachelor's degree. You're graduating in like a month. We're going to go in the order of the program. So Reed's going to go first. We're really excited. Jarrett Crone is going to come up second and talk about digital dualism. We've talked about a lot since he just finished and defended his thesis successfully. And then the lovely Mark Smith will finish us out tonight. And Mark's almost done. You'll be done in
I'm not graduating, but I am lovely.
You're close. Yeah, you are. And you're staying for a little bit longer. So we'll hold questions till the end, so hopefully you'll keep track of some questions. They'll each go for about 15 minutes, and then we'll ask them also, have the panel come up and ask them some questions. And I think that's all I need to say about that. Okay, we ready? I'm very excited. They'll be switching out their presentation stuff in between, so just have a couple minutes in between. Yay. Thanks. Presenters. Is it coming?
Yeah, it's going to take a while.
Turn it off.
No, turn it off. That's the warm up.
Turn it off. Did you already?
I thought it turned off. Is it right there?
It's probably just warming up. It's building the anticipation.
Was it ever on? Behind us?
No, it wasn't on. Well, I am Reed Wagner. Like I said, I'm going to be presenting on an honors thesis I've been working on these last 2 semesters called The Psychological Reality of Iconism and Its Impact on the English Language. And so this is just going to be kind of a brief, jam-packed synthesis of what I've been doing. So I apologize in advance for talking quickly, but I'm going to try to talk about a lot of stuff. So here we go. First of all, sound symbolism, what is it? In essence, sound symbolism is the idea that an individual phoneme or a cluster of phonemes can possess meaning. And so you'll have to forgive me, Ella, when I describe what a phoneme is, but essentially, to be quick, it's kind of a single unit of sound, so to speak. So ah, or e, or t, or buck, those are all different phonemes, and oftentimes they're represented by a single letter or a few letters. And so sound symbolism posits that these phonemes actually have some kind of meaning, which is controversial because in the past, for most of linguistic history, we have thought that the sign is arbitrary, or as Shakespeare said, that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And so sound symbolism comes along and says that, in fact, certain sounds can better represent certain reference in the real world, or that certain words that have these sounds are more likely to have meanings that they're paired with. And so I'm going to talk about 2 main kinds of sound symbolism. The first is phonesthesia, and it's kind of how I first got interested in sound symbolism. It's not actually relevant to my thesis as a whole, but I wanted to start with it. Phonesthesia is sound symbolism established through convention. And so basically you have some sort of prototypical word, and the most common example is the GL words with the initial consonant cluster GL that mean reflected light. So you have glisten and glimmer and gleam and glare and glow. You have all of these GL words that mean light, and it's very unlikely that it's just coincidence. And so what phonesthesia predicts is that at some point there was a prototypical GL word, hypothetically let's say it's the word glow, and that other words, when we want to make a new word or we want to adopt a word from a different language that means light, we're going to be more likely to create or adopt words that also have the same consonants that this original light word had. So through this process of creating and adopting new words, the initial consonant cluster goal is kind of propagated throughout language. So that, in a nutshell, is the idea of phonesthesia. Now, what my honors thesis focused on is actually kind of in contrast to that explanation of sound symbolism, called iconism. And iconism says that, in fact, the phonemes themselves have some kind of inherent properties or qualities that give them their meaning. It's not about how language was used in the past, but it's actually something about the phonemes themselves that gives them this sort of meaning. So what do I mean by meaning? Like, what kind of meaning do these phonemes have? So the most commonly talked about types of meaning are big, small iconism and round angular iconism, and those have kind of been the two main focuses of my honors thesis. Big, small iconism is a difference between vowels. So a low back vowel like ah is supposedly thought of as a big vowel, and a small or a small vowel like a high front vowel like e is going to be small. And where round angular symbolism actually focuses on consonants, and so voiceless stops like p and t and k are all angular consonants, and round consonants are voiced consonant continuants such as and o and And so I'm going to talk in a moment how these different consonants have meaning, because it's kind of, I think in some ways it's intuitive, right? We can think of ah as big and e as small, but why do we think that? So first I want to kind of give a short explanation of how iconism can exist. And so the first kind of explanation I want to talk about is an articulatory explanation that focuses on how we actually say these sounds. And I'm going to use big, small symbolism as a way to talk about that. So these are two diagrams of tongue positions during articulation of different vowels. And just focusing on these two, the high front vowel E and the low back vowel ah, you can see that they're in opposite positions. So in the vowel E, the tongue is at a very high and very forward position in the mouth. And what that means is that the vocal tract is constricted, it's small. In addition to the tongue position, when you say the vowel E, you can feel your lips kind of constrict. In opposition to that ah, the vocal tract is wider, it's kind of a larger oral cavity. The tongue is at a lower and a farther back position, which means there's more space within the mouth. And in addition to that, when you say ah, your lips kind of expand in contrast to E. And so we have like a big space for ah and a small space for E, and that's possibly why we can think of these lower back vowels as being big vowels and these high front vowels as being small vowels. So that's the articulatory explanation of how iconism, how phoneme meaning can exist. I want to also talk about the second type of explanation, an acoustic explanation. And I should say that both of these explanations they're just means of trying to make iconism understandable. They're not verified. I think that they're at least plausible explanations, but again, they're just kind of attempts at explaining something that we know exists, or that many of us believe exists. So the acoustic explanation then has to do with how we hear sounds. And so these two words, kiki and boba, you can tell kiki here is supposed to be the angular sound, right? And boba is the round sound. And so we're going to be focusing on the voicing in the two sounds, which has been highlighted by this kind of this bottom line of red dots. You can see that when somebody says, this is basically a recording of someone saying kiki, you can see that there is a very distinct pause in the voicing during the pronunciation of the consonant K. And if you look on the other side at B, the voicing is very consistent. Looking at this bottom line here, the voicing is very consistent throughout the word. So what does this have to do with roundness and angularity? Well, what a famous neuroscientist, V.S. Ramachandran, has guessed at is that there's a property of undulation or of sharp definitive changes within the sound of kiki. So you have a very sharp, fast, distinct pause of the voicing and then renewal of the voicing that doesn't occur in the hearing, the acoustics of boba. And so just like in the world, a tactile shape might have very distinct and sharp edges. It might be an angular shape. And a round shape is going to have a very kind of continual surface area, right? And so in that way, boba is, and these voiced consonants are rounded, and these voiceless stops are angular. So I know maybe that seems like kind of a stretch, right? Maybe I think that we need kind of an additional explanation to satisfy how we actually think about these things, right? Because we're still taking these kind of abstract properties of bigness and smallness and of roundness and angularity and applying them to very different senses. And there has been neurological research that has suggested that there may be some places in the brain where this kind of what's called cross-modal abstraction happens. And so cross-modal abstraction sounds fancy, but it's basically just these cross-modalities, these different senses, right, of touch and of hearing kind of coming together within the brain. And so you can see this yellow area here is called the visual word form area. It's part of the left fusiform gyrus. And it's located between the temporal lobe here and the occipital lobe here in the back of the brain. And scientists and linguists have guessed is that possibly it's the location, it's kind of at a juncture between, the temporal lobe is for auditory and language processing, particularly the left temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe has to process vision. And so it's kind of at this juncture between vision processing and language processing, and possibly, maybe, it's the place where we can kind of create an abstract representation of these properties that are very, very different in actuality. Because bigness, when we think about vision, we can think of bigness as being, photons hitting our retina. And when we talk about articulation, bigness is just a way that we feel our mouths are moving, right? So they're very different things, but hypothetically, we have places in the brain that suggest that maybe these are the centers where proximal abstraction of the two senses can kind of come together and allows us to interpret these different senses as having some property that's in common. The second area here, this red area, is called the angular gyrus, and the explanation is basically the same. It's between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, which has to do with touch and with proprioception. And there has actually been studies done that show patients with damage to the angular gyrus cannot make these cross-modal abstractions that people without damage to the angular gyrus can make. And so there's studies done that I'm going to talk about in a moment where participants are asked to identify different words with different kinds of sounds in them, and statistically, most participants identify the big sounds with the big reference and the small sounds with the small reference, and same for round angular symptoms. However, patients with damage to the angular gyrus are unable to do that, which suggests that it provides at least some evidence for this as a center where iconism is basically kind of generated in the brain. So now I want to move on and talk about actual studies that are done that support the psychological reality of iconism. And so what I mean by psychological reality is that it's not just a conscious phenomenon that's happening within our brains as we're thinking about these things. It's one thing to say, oh yes, I can kind of see how I could be big and how E could be small. I don't know, when we're analyzing poetry, when we're thinking about how different sounds have different meanings, right? It's a very conscious processing that's going on. But what I'm going to argue is that iconism isn't just this kind of conscious processing. It happens at a subconscious level, and it's a very integral way at how we process language. And so the first example of one of these neologism studies, where researchers take new words and ask participants to basically in some way define or predict the meaning of these new words. The first was done by Sapir in the 1930s. And he used the words meal and mall, and both of them referred to a table, either a big table or a small table. The table was just kind of an arbitrary referent that he chose. And what he found is that when participants were assigning one word to one table, over 90% of the time, mall was assigned to the big table, and meal was assigned to the small table. And many studies like this have been carried out since the 1930s. The big problem with these studies is that they ask participants to actually think about the sounds. They're very explicit in their directions, right? Like, think about these two sounds that you have no idea what they mean. Now compare them to something in the real world, which is bigger. And so it kind of allows for this conscious processing to occur. So what linguists have done more recently is to try to simulate a natural language learning environment. And one example of this is what Westbury has done. And I don't have time to go into the study in depth, but if someone wants to turn on the lights, that would be great. I've kind of drawn a very simple, not real, something that I just schematic of what Westbury has done. So basically, he's taken, what he asked participants to do was to identify whether a word was a real word or a non-word. And then he would time their lexical access time, which means he timed how long it took them to identify a word as real or not. And he created these different frames around the word. So some words would have a kind of an angular, spiky frame drawn around the words, and some would have a more rounded frame drawn around the words. And then the words would contain different phonemes. So he would use, for instance, in the real word condition, he would use a word like balloon that has a lot of these supposedly rounded consonants in it, and a word like kite, which supposedly has a lot of angular consonants in it. And he would time them to see how long it took them to identify real words and non-words. And what he found is that in the incongruent condition, where the sound symbolism of the words and the frames did not match, they were incongruent with each other. In those conditions, participants took a much longer time to identify a word as being a non-word. While in the congruent conditions, where you can see the sound sound symbolism of the words matched the frames that they were in, participants did this at a much more quick time. They were able to identify a not real word as not real very quickly compared to the incongruent conditions, which provides evidence that it's not a conscious, iconism isn't a conscious phenomenon, right? It's something they weren't really thinking about the sounds and the words. They weren't supposed to think about the frames that were around the words. In the debriefing, none of them had said that they had thought about these in any way. Yet, we can see that iconism, that the letter, just the sounds that the words are making, influences how we think about language in a very natural, kind of innate sort of way. So then, just really briefly, I want to talk about kind of a disparity between actual language and iconism research, because what people have done, I mean, you would expect, right, if this is a very natural way for us to interact with language through iconism, through this sound symbolism, then you would expect it to actually be in English, right? Like you would expect it, so it doesn't necessarily have to come from language, it's not phonesthesia, but nevertheless you would expect it to have some kind of impact on language. But what we see is that people have taken these big word categories, like words that mean big and words that mean small, or a lot of words that have to do with angularity or with roundness, etc., and they've looked for different distributions of different phonemes within these word categories. And so you would expect that in words that mean big, right, you would find a lot of ah sounds, and in words that mean small, you would find a lot of e sounds, but just think about the words big and small, right? That doesn't work at all. And so, there is basically no statistical significance whatever that has been found yet that suggests that iconism is apparent in natural language. But I should say within English, because that was the focus of my thesis, and there are other languages where there are some exceptions, but for the most part, within English, there is no statistically significant distribution of phonemes, which is weird. So how is this the case? Well, going back to Westbury's study, participants were able to identify non-real words much more quickly in the congruent condition than the incongruent condition, but when the words were actually real words, there was no difference between their lexical access time. They identified a word as a real word at the same speed, regardless of whether it was surrounded by a spiky frame or an angular frame or what kind of sound symbolism it had in it. And so what this suggests is that the semantics of a word can potentially nullify the semantics of a phoneme. That word meaning gets rid of iconism, because when we have context for a word, I mean, if we're looking at meal and mall and we have no idea what they mean and they're not real words, then yes, maybe we can rely on the sound symbolism to help us understand these words, to just kind of help us guess, or possibly in instances of language acquisition where we have no context for what a given word means. But as soon as a word is assigned like a real world referent, as soon as it has some kind of meaning, which all words do because the purpose of language is to communicate with one another, then iconism kind of disappears. And so this is just kind of a hypothetical conclusion that my thesis came to and is not particularly substantiated, but that's kind of what I wanted to leave you with. So yes, that is my presentation, iconism. It's real, it exists, I think.